Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. And jeg ville bare sige, at jeg taler dansk, så hvis nogensinde det er nogen, I ikke forstår, så bare sæt en hånd op med en C, som betyder clarification på XR-sprog, og så skifter jeg til dansk. Okay? So it's a real honor to be here, and thank you for being here. And like Sina was saying, I have been an activist both here and in the UK with Extinction Rebellion, always with Extinction Rebellion. But I want to just wind back a little bit to the very beginning of how I got involved in being a sort of amateur environmentalist, if you like. Because I think, like many of us here, we think about it for a long time before we actually do anything. And I spent probably about 20 years thinking about it and doing nothing except, when the internet came along, I did this thing we call clicktivism, which is activism by clicking, and on petitions and things like that online. So I was clicking away on Greenpeace, I was clicking away on Friends of the Earth and 350.org and all these things you've probably clicked on too. And I haven't stopped clicking. But there came a point where I really felt that it wasn't enough and I needed to do something physical with my body, put myself on the streets and put my voice out there, because there was this growing concern I had, which I felt I just needed to express in some other way. As Sina said, I've written I've written several novels that are related to the environment in some way, and the last two were climate thrillers. I would call them climate thrillers, which were published in England but also in Denmark. But I still felt that wasn't really enough. So Extinction Rebellion started it was 2018 in the UK. And it seemed to come out of nowhere. It was suddenly there, and it was very, very exciting. And it just seemed like the kind of thing for me. But did I do anything about it? No. I told my son, who was a wildlife biologist, that there was this meeting, and let's meet there. And it was one of the first big public meetings of Extinction Rebellion. And at the last minute, I couldn't go because I had a deadline on something I was doing. I happened to be in London. I've been living here for 10 years. So I was on a trip to the UK. I said to him, let's go to this. I couldn't go at the last minute, but he went. And he loved it, and he immediately got involved, and they needed somebody, and this was the very early days, to run their social media team. So he was doing that from the start at the age of 23. It's got much bigger since, and there are whole teams of people doing these things now in the UK. But back then, it was just him and running the whole thing. But he loved it. He was very inspired. I will never know how often he got arrested, but he did get arrested quite a lot. I did not want to get arrested. I was very clear on that. And I think one of the most important things to say is you don't have to be arrested, okay? You do not have to be arrested. My husband's been arrested not so long ago, actually, here in Denmark. I'm not going to be. I'm a British citizen, and since Brexit, I need to apply for citizenship here, or I want to apply for citizenship here, and I can't run the risk. And that's fine. There's plenty you can do without going to prison or appearing in court. That said, my son was very much looking forward to his big day in court because he vandalized the Brazilian embassy in London. My husband's looking forward to his day in court here in Denmark. We don't have a date yet, but that's fine for some people, and if they feel they can afford to do that, that's great. Anyway, to spool back to 2018, I wasn't doing anything. Then 2019 came along, and I was in contact with a couple of other British writers who really, like me, wanted to do something but didn't know what they could do. So we started having a few Zoom conversations, and I said to my son, whose activist name was Iggy Fox, I said to my son, how can we make this happen in a more sort of concrete way, which isn't just about getting, academics involved or, getting other writers to be involved. And he said, well, form a group and make it part of Extinction Rebellion. And he introduced me to another writer who was already deep in Extinction Rebellion. And that's how Writers Rebel began. We had our first big action at the Trafalgar Square Rebellion in London in 2019. And my son had been one of those who'd managed to shut down and secure Trafalgar Square. And I remember we met there and he was very, very busy and I was very, very busy. But it was very exciting. We sat in a little cafe. We turned off our telephones. We sat on our telephones. We spoke French because we were both French speakers because there were police everywhere. And we just talked about how exciting it was. And then we both went off to do our separate things that day. We had 40 writers, 40 really quite big names, who agreed to come along and talk. Because what we discovered was that although our big thing had been that writers don't care, writers do not care. There are not enough people writing about this, not enough journalists, and not enough fiction writers, not enough screenwriters. So we wanted to urge people to do something and start writing about it. So we wrote to about 100 writers and we got 40. And once we got the few big names like Ali Smith and others on board, suddenly others wanted to join. And we had 40 writers and it was electric. It was just fantastic. I mean, the whole of Trafalgar Square was full of people anyway, and there were lots of other things going on. But we had a stall and we had about 300 people. They sat down and they blocked the road to be our audience. So we had a sort of ready-made roadblock in case we needed one, which we didn't. The police stood back and some of them seemed to quite enjoy it. So we had a lot of great speeches and that really energized us and we felt we were a group and we should take it further. So we made a website and we run blogs every week. If you go to writersrebel.com and you're a writer and would like to write something for us, then please send something in. So we just got more and more people involved. We have a weekly newsletter. I'm busy starting up a Rebel library, which is a fantastic resource. It's going to be an online resource featuring lots of different books, poetry, fiction, non-fiction, climate classics. So that anyone can just read what's available. Anyone who wants a good book list can find it. So, we've been pretty busy. And since that time, 2 of our core members have been arrested. Actually, it was last Monday they were arrested for pouring oil over the doorstep of the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is basically a lobby group which supports and encourages the fossil fuel industry. So things like that, none of us were planning to be arrested at the beginning, but after a while, a couple of our members said, no, it's time, I'm ready. And that was fantastic. What I would say about getting involved is, first, for me, it was about getting informed. I was already reading quite a lot because I was writing these books. But I decided I'm just going to read everything I can. And I did that. And of course, when you read a lot about the climate and ecological emergency, wherever your interest is, I was very interested in methane at one point because, well, I still am, but methane was a big thing for me because I was writing methane gas. So I wrote a novel which centered around the fracking of methane, which happens underwater and is potentially very, very dangerous. And no one really talks about it. But if there were a methane accident, it would be mega. So it could be methane. my son was very involved in wild animal rescue and conservation. He worked a lot in South America and Africa. And I've always been very interested in animal welfare. So that was the sort of, there was the climate part, which was methane. There was the biodiversity part, which was wild animals. And our group did a lot of online events because, people are spread all over the place. And we realized very early on, not everyone is in London, and nor should they be. So we opened it up. And we did a creative writing workshop, which was free for anyone who wanted to join. So that sort of thing was a way of sort of spreading the word even more. So the first thing is to get informed. The second thing is to get connected. And getting connected, you're doing it now. You're here. You're meeting other people with the same concerns. And that's important because, as you know, most people don't give a shit. They just don't. The polls show that people do actually care, and they care more and more. But governments don't seem to care. We know that. We've had, I don't know how many COP meetings have there been by now? 27, of course, because we just every single one of them has failed. I mean, better than nothing. But at the same time, not nearly enough. I'm shocked every time. And I'm shocked every time they come out and say it was a success. Especially, and the more of a failure it was, the more of a success some governments claim that it was. We have Antonio Guterres saying again and again and again, in the starkest language, in the clearest language, we are heading for apocalypse. And still, no one seems to take it very seriously. In Britain, I think it was in 2021, there was a study which showed that overall the media covered the subject of cake more than the environment. Cake was a big thing in 2021. It was, it was kind of pandemic thing, and then there was this great British bake-off, and everyone was into cake. And the media preferred to write about cake and do stories about cake than the environment. That's where we are. So that's, when I say no one gives a shit, I don't mean that we don't give a shit. I mean that, generally speaking, there is this terrible apathy, particularly in the media and in governments. Governments, they have 4 years, 5 years. So they're thinking of the next election and not the next generation. And what XR is trying to do, what we're all trying to do, is to get this thinking into the longer term. Get them thinking about, what's going to happen to my kids, my grandkids? What sort of world are they going to be living in? And what we need, and we discuss this a lot in our group, Writers Rebel and Forfattere Sergrond, is a new narrative. We need some new narratives which are long-term narratives, which are looking ahead, which are not all about, this sort of classic hero's journey. Every Hollywood movie you see is the hero's journey, okay? Where some guy goes out and saves something or other, comes back, and everything's better. And we've been living that kind of myth for years and years and years, where the individual does stuff. But actually, it's communities that get stuff done. And that's what we see again and again and again in Extinction Rebellion and in other groups that are doing things. Look at Greta Thunberg. I mean, she's the most wonderful example of somebody who began her own little hero's journey, but very quickly it became a massive global movement. And it's that kind of persistence and that sort of doggedness, just to keep going, to keep at it, that really, really counts, I think. You do get burnout when you're an activist. And Extinction Rebellion, I've noticed this, and I saw it very much with my son, is very good at saying, no, you just take a moment, step back for a month, just regenerate a bit, take your time, because it can be very exhausting. So it's a very caring organisation in that way, and very, very important to take care of ourselves and each other before we can actually go out and do the big stuff. So it's very, very good at taking care of all of us. I think you arrested me once. Did you? Yeah, I think there was a non-violent direct action training in Denmark. You were the most wonderful cop. You were absolutely brutal. You were so brutal. You carried me off. Because what you'll find when you join is there will be a non-violent direct action training, which I really recommend you go to. It's great fun. And you practice being arrested and being told off by a brutal policeman. What's your name? Sorry. Andreas. Andreas was really good at that because he'd been arrested himself and he knew the kind of thing these cops say. And I was quite shocked because they are much more brutal than British cops here in Denmark. So these are the things that you can be prepared for if you decide you might one day be arrested. So you become connected and then you become engaged with others. It's not for... I think one of the things that stopped me before from getting involved in a group was I'm a writer. I don't like groups. I like to sit at home on my own and write fiction. So it was a kind of big jump for me to hang out with other people. And of course, I discovered I loved it. But I still need to sit on my own at home and write. But it doesn't mean I can't also be out and, doing things like this, which I would never have thought of doing before, never, because I was too shy. So that kind of thing, you realize as you are a member of a group like this that you change. And you change in ways that you like and that make you feel good. So the other thing I would say is we're all good at something. We're all good at something. We all know what our biggest talent is or what we're most engaged by, what we're most interested in. So for me, it was writing, and so Writers Rebel, and for the others in my group, Writers Rebel was able to, we were able to channel our talents into something. Now, every one of you here has something to offer, something you're good at, whatever it is. I mean, the Extinction Rebellion was set up by, a couple of the people at the beginning were graphic designers, which is why, Exile's graphics are always so good and striking. And you've all seen those banners and you've all seen the symbol and everything else. Everything that you can offer is good. My son was very good at recruiting people. He was fantastic at recruiting people. He couldn't go anywhere without telling them about Exile and recruiting them. And he was very good at energizing people. I think at this point I'm going to get very personal and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my son. He's the second of my two sons and his name's Raphael. And he used the name Iggy Fox as an activist. And like I said, he was arrested many times. And then at the beginning of 2020, he died. It was on the 6th of February 2020. And I received a call from his dad, my ex-husband, saying he was dead. As it turned out, he'd been running and he fell, he collapsed. As it turned out, he had that same heart defect that Christian Eriksen, the football player, had. But he didn't have any ambulances on hand, or he wasn't next to East Hospitalet, he was somewhere far away. So he died. And as any of you who are parents can imagine, or brothers or sisters, or know any young people can imagine, it was devastating and dreadful. He was so busy. he was so busy when he died. He was doing a crowdfunder for a documentary he was making about anti-poaching, all-female anti-poaching units in South Africa. He'd set up an organization called the Wild Work, which was for wildlife workers. It was a kind of union, a global union for wildlife workers, and he was very involved in that at the time of his death. He was awaiting trial for the vandalization of the Brazilian embassy. He had huge plans. And then suddenly, there were no plans because there was no RAF. What it did to me, apart from all the usual things you would expect it does to lose a child, was it did make me think, I'm so glad he did everything he did in the time he had. In his 25 years, he did an unbelievable amount. But most importantly of all, he really inspired other people, other young people. There are still actions being done in his name. On Monday, the action against the Institute of Economic Affairs, that was dedicated to him. You know, actions are being dedicated to him all the time. And that's a way in which he lives on. What I'd like to do is end by playing you a short clip. It's a film made by me and his friends. And it's a speech. It's not even a speech. It's something I found in one of his notebooks after he died. And it's really a sort of love affair to activism. And what it does is it really encapsulates how he felt about being part of this movement and doing things that could change the world. So if you could start that little clip.
Nothing's ever inspired me so powerfully.
Nothing has ever given me so much hope or such a sense of purpose.
Nothing has ever been so clear to me
as these visions that I have for the future.
I call them visions because, unlike hope or dreams,
they feel solid, tangible, traceable, catchable.
Reality in the making.
What I am planning is nothing short of a revolution. What I'm expecting is an entirely new era for life on Earth.
I'm not foolish enough to think that I can do this alone.
While people are the source of the endless destruction we must put a stop to,
they are also the key to achieving our goals.
So spark, shelter, and nurture the flame of passion until it roars.
That energy, that power can be harnessed to change the world.
Perhaps we'll reach this brave new world in a decade.
Perhaps we'll still be moving towards that, long after I'm dead.
What matters is that we keep moving on until we get there.
When the light leaves my eyes and I pass on, do not weep for me, for I am not dead.
All that I ever was and ever will be lies in the flame of passion that consumed me.
The same flame that burns in all those who believe in what I believed.
I will not be dead until my dream is.
I will not fade away until my vision does.
I'll not be gone until my hopes are.
Thank you, everyone. And now I hand over to you. Oh, no, has anyone got any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Was he in the movie?
Yeah.
With the long hair?
Yeah. He's the one with the long red hair. Yes.
Yeah, it's open for questions or comments or...
Yes, I have another question.
Yes.
Because I can actually recognize quite a lot. I don't know how old you are, but I'm obviously older than many of the rebels. So I'm sort of feeling also a little bit awkward sometimes trying to engage in this. And then you said the word shy. I think I can relate to that. How can you overcome the shy?
Well, you just have. Yes, I think it's funny, isn't it? Because I was fine as a writer, you know, doing interviews and talking, but this is very different because it's much more personal. And I think you do it by doing it and by watching other people doing it. And I'm not shy at all now. And I think I learned, I mean, it was one of the many things I learned from my son. I think he didn't feel he was naturally someone who could speak to an audience. And then when he found himself in a situation where he had things on his heart and in his mind that needed saying, you don't hold back. It's a kind of strange alchemy that happens. You find yourself inspired and energized by, I don't know, it's a kind of collective consciousness, I guess. But something in you steps up. And I think you will find yourself perfectly capable. And also, when you mention older people, well, I'm an older person too. I turned 63 yesterday, and when I go on any marches, or when you do, you'll see, actually, the interesting thing is, there are a lot of young people, and there are a lot of older people. I mean, there's XR families, which is very often grandparents and their grandchildren. And there's a generation kind of in the middle, in their 30s and 40s, they're too busy. They've got kids. I mean, they're not all too busy because you see them with their strollers and, you know, they take their babies on marches and that's absolutely beautiful. But there are a lot of older people and some very old people. I mean, in Britain, there was an old man in his 90s who got arrested again and again and again. And I mean, these are real heroes, these people. So you won't be alone. You won't, you know, you won't be alone if you feel you're older. Believe me, there are lots of us.
I would also add to that one of the things one can do is join with others in a group in Extinction Rebellion, so you have like your crowd. Because there is so many different people, and sometimes it's very difficult in a wide movement to find your spot. So actually to team up with somebody else and say, are you coming to the common meeting? Then we can meet, you know, or so. It makes it much easier.
Yes, I would add to that actually, because when I first, not long after Extinction Rebellion started, and I was living here, I thought I want to do something, it's got to be something I can do online. So I was involved in writing the XR newsletter, you know, editing it and so on. But it wasn't very satisfying for me. It didn't feel like it was enough. And there were lots of other people doing it, and I found myself a bit confused by it. And so it was really only when I found my group, or set up my group, that it began to gel. So sometimes there's a bit of feeling around, you know. In the UK, there's XR doctors, XR scientists, XR lawyers, you know, so it could be a group that's related to your profession. And they're very, very active, especially XR doctors and scientists. They're extraordinary. And XR lawyers are brilliant because, you know, they can help you if you have a court case. And on the subject of court cases, if I can just add briefly to that, I don't know if you've heard of the Shell 7. There were 7 activists in the UK who, I think it was in 2021, they vandalised the headquarters of Shell, the fossil fuel giant, in the UK. And they caused thousands of pounds worth of damage to the building. And they did this deliberately, knowing they would be arrested. They were arrested. And then when their court case came up, they were let free. And this is the power of the courtroom when you have a jury. Because, yeah, they'd done the damage, and they didn't pretend they hadn't done the damage. But they all spoke so incredibly eloquently in court that they convinced the jury that the moral issues outweighed the issue of criminal damage. And so they were acquitted, and it was a landmark case. So I think, you know, these arrests and these court cases really, really count because they can shift the public mood. Yeah. So they are an absolutely brilliant way.
Speaking of that, there's just been news that Greta Thunberg has summoned 600 young people, and they have also now, how do you say, made a case for the Swedish government. Sued, yes.
Yeah.
And I just had a little rant about that the other day on Facebook, where I'm like, okay, so we hear about these lawsuits, but is there any effect of them?
Yes, I think the answer is yes, yes. And I think this is, I mean, I've always been very interested in the zeitgeist, and I can really feel through things like this, the zeitgeist is shifting, public opinion is shifting. And I mean, here in Denmark, we are quite conformist. We're not very keen to sort of stand out and look different from other people and do things that are different. And yet, there are more and more people doing it. And that's because something is shifting. People are realizing, the public is realizing that our governments are letting us down. And our media is letting us down for the most part, with some great exceptions, but generally,
I mean, the only media here in Denmark takes this serious in information. All the rest is just, sugaring cake. I don't know the expression, but there was hardly any talk about the COP27 now in
Yeah. I think in general, I think maybe it's to do with the fact that we are in such a crisis. Everyone wants to turn away from it, and that's part of the first stage of the process, I suppose. I mean, there have been. I'm very interested in the parallels between personal grief and climate grief, because I think there are some very important parallels there. There are stages of grief. There's shock and disbelief and denial. I mean. And I think a lot of the media are still in the denial stage. And denialism has changed because no one can really claim anymore that it's not happening. But what they'll do is they'll minimize how serious it is. Or they'll say there's a techno fix, so don't worry. Technology will, Elon Musk will sort it. Somebody will sort it. That's just not true.
No. He is on the contrary, not going to solve it.
Exactly.
I've just seen this series on DR where you follow these tech billionaires, and I was horrified because now all three of them, Elon, Zuckerberg, what was the third? They all want to immigrate to another
Well, they're welcome to.
Why did they go, guys? This planet, it's crazy.
It is crazy. But anyway, after the sort of denial, then there is, there's anger. And you see, I think you see a lot of anger. You saw my son looking very angry when he was out there. But that comes from this sort of passion that filled him. And so then supposedly there is acceptance. Well, I think that's the bit we need to talk about, because for me, we don't accept what's happening. Extinction Rebellion is not in the business of accepting what's happening and adapting and that sort of thing. We need to stop this thing insofar as it can be stopped.
And since we're waiting for the rise, I think me and Laura will just take over
and
talk a little bit about Extinction Rebellion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.